A very good afternoon to everyone. It is my proud privilege to be on this Refining and Petrochemical World 2021 with a very relevant theme, flexible refining for future sustainability. Let me also wish on this inaugural session Dr. Ram Kumar, Director IOCL R&D, and great regards for Secretary MOPNG, Mr. Tarun Kapoor, who would also be sharing his views in this inaugural session. My compliments to the organizers for setting up this conference, so very relevant in times of today, where the energy transition and the greening of the environment while maintaining sustainable, affordable energy to one and all holds the key to the future. Let me start by sharing what kind of global hydrocarbon scenario exists today. And if we see the prices of oil, a lot of investments, a lot of decision making is going into the prediction of the oil prices in the future. However, India as a nation, which has grown in terms of dependence on oil from almost 75-77% to 5 years before, standing today at 85%, is actually very critical and sensitive to both the prices and the future refining capacity. If you look at gas, it is wedged between decarbonization and the focus on renewables. Companies are also looking in terms of their strategy going on in the future to diversify their businesses from hydrocarbon to cleaner products and clean technologies. Clean technologies in terms of CCUS, hydrogen, which is moving on to the future. And petrochemicals actually bring the common link between the maximization of profits both to an existing asset as well as looking into expansion of refining capacity. When we look at the world has moved in a transition so very rapid in the near decade or so gone past, moving from 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was signed and thereafter the Paris Agreement with the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 to a target of more than 2 million electrical vehicles on the road by 2019 and to net zero targets by various nations and our own INDCs, which we are committed to meet as a nation. So this transition, this transformation is really moving at a very rapid pace, and the organizations must keep abreast of the happenings and transform in equal speed moving in the future. Now, looking at renewables which are powering the world, which is really actually outpacing the investments in thermal power plants, is slated to go at almost 240 gigawatts of renewables in the year 2050. And so many nations have looked at going to a net zero target by 2050, nearly fossil fuel free. And we can always see in some of the countries in the developed European Unions, there is already an excess of even green power during different seasons available to share with their neighbors. In that scenario, when we see the fossil fuels demand in future, the shrinkage of oil demand from today, something like about 100 million barrels a day, 102 million barrels a day. If we go on to this kind of pace of renewable penetration will move to only 20 to 25 million barrels a day in 2050, which is huge reduction. Of course, there will be a peak of gas demand because gas is looking at a bridge fuel, and by 2030 it is expected that the gas demand would be almost 20% up than what it is today, maybe 15 to 20% up, and would go down to pre-2000 level by 2050. Overall basis, if we see, the fossil fuel reduction will only begin in the mid-30s. Till then, there would be a need to continuously have the energy sector and the nations meeting a demand in an overall fossil fuel method. But the shrinking of demand is predicted to go from 2030 all the way to almost 64% reduction by 2050. Now, all this is encompassing one specific need to lower the carbon dioxide emissions. In 2018, it stood at around 34 gigatons, which we are emitting into the atmosphere. And if this continued focus is there in terms of investments, in terms of technology, penetration, bringing competitive technologies into the space of oil and gas, the transformation again is likely to go in around 2030, and the per capita CO2 emission, which is looking at 4.3 tons on an average in 2010, and about 3 tons, which is likely to go in 2030, can actually lower to 1/4 to about 1 ton of CO2 per capita by 2050. And this is essential to meet the climate goal objectives. Now, therefore, this refinery capacity that we have today in the nation, and which is likely to grow to 440 million tons per annum in 2030, that's a target. We need to keep pace with the growth of the nation, and we need to also continue to be an exporter of the highest quality of fuels around our neighboring countries and in the world. The essence is to have this refining capacity flexible and sustainable in the future. This is imperative because India's energy demand is expected to double almost to 1,500 metric tons oil equivalent by 2035. We have committed almost 24 trillion rupees to the energy sector in building the national energy pipeline. The capacity, as I mentioned, growing to 440 by 2030. We also aspire to move the natural gas mix to almost 15% by 2030. It is bridging the gap between both supply and the demand, and we have huge investments which are made into the pipeline, enhancing per capita consumption of petrochemical. And in this framework, this energy mix will have a huge share of renewables, and we are seeing this movement happening in the nation. And above all this, as EIL, we are also committed not just to bring technologies and implement projects in the space of both oil and gas, but moving forward, we are also looking into bringing more indigenous development in terms of manufacturing. And just about, I think, if I recall, mid-September, 15th of September to be exact, the Honorable Minister launched the Lakshya Bharat portal, which actually showcases the manufacturing capability of the nation, and also gives space and visibility to the investments which are to follow in the oil and gas sector in years to come, the specific equipments which are going to be required for the Indian manufacturing industry to supply. It then opens an avenue for the Indian manufacturers to look at technology transfers, to expand their own businesses, to look at investments in certain niche capabilities of equipment, wherein we can enhance the dependency on Indian manufacturing, which is very high in the refining sector, but there is huge room for it to grow in the petrochemical sector as well. Now, coming back to the flexible refining and sustainable future. And I keep saying that because this is the imperative of tomorrow. The net zero roadmap, if we were to see, looks at several things: the low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency, looking at consumer behavior, wherein there is a variety of energies available at different prices. So the behavior of the consumer is going to change as we see more and more types of energy, more and more forms of energy, more and more pricing, more and more policies. Looking at electric mobility, EVs, how FAME 2 is, changing the landscape, particularly when we look at the two-wheeler segment. Moving forward, looking at technologies of CCUS. There are a lot of financial and policy imperatives also in place, and as we continue, they will also form the backdrop of the road towards net zero. One very important element which cannot be missed in this complete journey is looking at green hydrogen, which has been announced by the Honorable Prime Minister from the ramparts of the Red Fort this Independence Day. There is initial demand which will be created by factoring in some percentage of green hydrogen in the refinery and the fertilizer, majority of which, almost more than 99% of hydrogen, goes to that industry. And that opens a roadmap coupled with the investments in the renewable power sector to kind of bring in a lowering of CO2 emissions. The other arm of this roadmap is the biofuel area, looking at biomass and waste utilization. There are already policies in place which is looking at hand-holding, capex subsidy for 2G ethanol plants, the biofuel policy which has opened up the avenue for the conventional sugar industry to look at dented corn, to look at excess food grains, and to even divert some of the base material for sugar production, which is flattened off in terms of demand, towards the target of meeting 20% ethanol blending by 2025. Today we are at 10% ethanol blending, and the preponement of the target is a step towards the industry putting in investments and revamping and doing bolt-on solutions to bring this renewable product into the gasoline pool. Now this, if we see, is also important from the strategy perspective of the company. And while we look at the two segments which are very, very critically examined, the one thing which we have seen much talked about is the color of hydrogen, whether we talk blue, green, brown, gray. In all ways, the effort is to reduce the CO2 footprint. This is again a very easy method to kind of look at the conversion of or electrolysis of water to bring in hydrogen into the refinery and fertilizer segment. And in future, looking at capture of CO2 from the flue gases, bringing in CCUS to turn the gray hydrogen to a blue hydrogen. Of course, there are various studies which are done, and we feel and we know that in times to come, the technology of electrolysis, whether it is alkaline electrolysis, alkali based, or PEM cells or SOEF, one of the there are so much of investment going into development of these technologies. The stackability, the volume in terms of per unit capacity of electrolysis, and so many other factors will actually lead to the penetration. The one very important factor which will actually change the dimension of green hydrogen is the storage, and there is huge work being done at all research institutes who are looking at converting these into actual on-ground solutions to look at energy storage. And once we have that breakthrough, it is likely that the roadmap to green hydrogen, the roadmap in general to the renewables actually integrating with process industry, could be really a game changer towards sustainability and the ultimate target of lowering emissions. So, as I also mentioned on biomass, we have the first, second generation, third generation, and ultimately the fourth generation, which is also looking at CO2 sequestration. This is the future, and it would be incomplete to mention that while we look at things today, we have to keep an eye on the future. So all our planning, all our research will be converted to commercial outputs in the future is resting on this this objective. So there's just one last point which I thought share, which is relevant to the conference, is the integration of the one component of the fuel which we are self-sufficient, which is coal. And when we look at coal, we are talking in tomorrow, there is a target of gasification of 100 million tons of coal by the Honorable Prime Minister. And there is always a lot of movement already in terms of gasification and conversion to multiple products, to poly generation. Herein the essentiality would be to look at clean coal technologies. So if you see in the larger, in a larger picture, the coal is also a very important element in terms of bringing self-reliance from conversion of coal to various products, reducing the oil dependency, and looking at the energy sector being less reliant on coal and more sustainable from renewable sources of energy. Now, this transition of clean energy is essential, as I mentioned a while back, that there is already, and we know that our government is committed. So there is an expanded role of the government. There is also the increase in role of the digitalization and increased automation, which is actually making the work processes easier, faster flow of information, decision making, and management platforms, which actually drive a lot of implementation of all these projects. There is the slowing of the pandemic, and I would like to also warn, or whatever, I would like to convey that we must be safe in the current times of festivities so that we do not bring back any wave to the nation. And we have already made 1 billion doses of vaccines, which is again a remarkable feat for a nation like ours. But we must keep, why I'm mentioning is because we must keep this in mind when we look at our own behavior, and as corporates we look at the response of our own policies and our own strategies for recovery out of this pandemic into the growth again. When we look at all this cannot be bridged, as I mentioned a while back, without the R&D and innovation. So it is important how to bridge the R&D with academia, to bridge it with industry, such that these platforms can be concurrently developed. They can bring out a competitive product, and this could also be dovetailed or handheld by even pre-competitive research, where the best in class is actually brought out into the market. With this, I believe that keeping some of these principles in mind, keeping some of these imperatives in mind, and looking at the industry with a broader horizon, looking at all types of energy, looking at all types of technology, looking at collaborations, looking at complementary skills from various organizations, and also being vigilant and aware of what is happening in the world, because the world is changing at a very fast pace, and we have to keep up with that fast pace, so that we become strong and we remain relevant in the future. So with this, I once again thank the organizers for having me here, and wish all the participants and the conference a huge success. And I hope the relevant discussions and the happenings on the sideline actually bring in the best out of this event. Thank you very much.